kind of have this bucket of how much we can handle, right? And these buckets are, I feel like, getting smaller and smaller in our kids. So I feel like this is why we're getting more and more picky eating because it's a symptom of something else happening in the body.
Welcome back to the Experience Health podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Vassar, a holistic health practitioner helping high achievers get to the root of chronic symptoms, gut issues, and fatigue. Today, we are talking about picky eating in kids from a deeper lens. Because it's often not just behavior, it's a signal that something in the body or nervous system is out of balance. So today I am joined by Lena Livinsky, a holistic pediatric feeding specialist and speech language pathologist who helps families decode picky eating at the root. So I'm super excited for this topic today. Lena Livinsky, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, diving right in, the first thing that I'd love to talk about is kind of like helping parents understand a little bit more about picky eating. Um, what would you say are some of the biggest myths or misconceptions that parents tend to have about picky eating?
I love this question, and it comes up a lot because I feel like there are so many. And one of the biggest ones, in my opinion, are that it's basically just a behavior, right? Because oftentimes what we see when there is picky eating, we will see behaviors around food, behaviors around eating, behaviors around the table. So oftentimes we'll hear things like, "Oh, no, it's just a behavior; it's gonna pass. Like, no big deal. It's just a phase. They're gonna grow out of it." And sometimes that happens when kids they learn how to eat and they're going through different milestones in life. Oftentimes they will have like maybe a few weeks here and there when they will start to get picky or change their food preferences, and that can happen and that's developmentally appropriate. But when we see it for extended periods of times and when it starts to become disruptive and it starts to really affect the child's diet, then it's no longer a phase. And actually, statistically, right now, with kind of the rate of chronic disease in general in children, which is really going up astronomically, but it's really 1 in 3 kids who are true picky eaters. So it's more among common. So, that myth about this just being a behavior and a phase, it's really not the thing to focus on because when we just focus on the tip of the iceberg on the behaviors around the table, then we really miss the root of what's causing it. And that's typically when we really don't address the real issue of what's happening. So those are probably my two biggest ones.
Okay. So, you would say that a lot of parents tend to think that it's just like a phase when there's something deeper going on.
Yeah, because they honestly, that thought gets oftentimes reinforced by the society and by the doctor. And
Mm.
doctors are very well-meaning pediatricians, they are in the field because they care, but oftentimes they're just not familiar with what truly is causing picky eating. So they'll say things like, oh, it's just a phase, don't worry about it. They'll eat when they're hungry,
Yeah.
this sort of thing. But if there is really some kind of a pathology underneath, like for reasoning behind it, or the child starts to really get these behaviors kind of like drilled in and they start to really, or they have them for a while and they really get used to them because of whatever was causing it goes it doesn't really get addressed, then then it becomes like a real issue.
I see. So,
Yeah.
what are some of the biggest like red flags or indicators that parents should actually start like paying attention to this for their kids?
Yeah, so there are many. But some of the biggest ones I would say, if we're gonna focus on like oral motor skills, if you see your child gagging a lot, right? They gag at a lot of foods, and kids and babies, as they learn how to eat, they will gag because it's kind of like this defensive mechanism, and also it's kind of the way they learn to explore. But if it's with a lot of foods, if it happens every day, multiple times a day, and it really goes on for a long period of time, I would call that a red flag. If kids are pocketing foods, or so they're like kind of holding onto it in their cheeks for extended periods of time, or if you go to brush your teeth and all of a sudden you find piece of dinner there or piece of lunch, or breakfast, whatever it is, then, it's kind of showing you that they don't have the skills they need to break down the food and actually swallow it. Um, there could be things actually with the swallowing mechanism. So there could be aspiration happening. There could be coughing when they're swallowing. There could be a lot of things there that could also be that might need some attention. Um, so those are kind of oral motor skills related. There could be gut related things or nutritional deficiency related things. So you'll see these sensory behaviors as well. So kind of refusing entire groups of foods or things that are harder to chew or things like vegetables and meats because sometimes it's just too hard for a child to break down. And if you'll see a kiddo who has kind of just preferences for carbs and sugars, and the beige diet, as we like to call it, oftentimes that's an indication of gut health issues and it's an indication usually of nutritional deficiencies.
Okay. So you mentioned
Yeah.
gut health a couple times. What role specifically does gut health play in picky eating and how does it like specifically influence that?
Yeah, so there is actually, I mean, it plays a huge role in it because we know that the gut and the brain are connected. So I think we're just kind of scratching the surface of what it really means. But it's super important because if the gut is affected, it's going to give us different food preferences and different kind of behaviors around food. It can influence things like our appetite. It can influence things like hunger signals. It can influence things like cravings, right? Because oftentimes when we have overgrowth of the bad bacteria, and I'm just simplifying here because I think gut is very complex, but if we have an overgrowth or not enough of the good guys, then we're going to have cravings for the bad foods because we don't really eat our food, but the gut, the bacteria in our gut, it eats the food, they eat the food and they digest it, right? So it's once we have these kind of cravings and these maybe appetite for foods that we're not supposed to be eating, or maybe we have too much appetite or not enough appetite. Maybe we don't want to eat things like that, or maybe we don't have good hunger signaling. Maybe we don't feel when we're hungry, or perhaps, we might never get this kind of signaling, or maybe we're hungry too much. It can kind of go both ways. All of these things, and digestion, it could be influenced by the gut imbalances.
I see. In your opinion, when you're working with people who, or I guess working with kids who are picky eaters, a lot of times, does it tend to be like a mix of these, or do you try to figure like which one it is for them?
Oh, it's usually a mix.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's usually it's so connected, right? And this is just like a very general overview. There could be so many different things going on underneath. This is why I like to look at just kind of like the biology of the child or kind of like their health in general, because I think there's so many things going on in health, things like nutritional deficiencies and constipation and other things that could be influencing our picky eating. Um, and same thing with the gut, right? So we want to look at all these different areas as well as the behaviors around the table and how we explore food and whatnot, and kind of make this into sort of like this really beautiful dance because there's just so many things affecting it, that
Yeah.
it's really rare there's just one thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Same
Yeah.
thing with my field too. It's never one
Yeah.
thing.
No.
So yeah,
Different
we love that.
causes. Yeah.
Let me see. I wanted to ask, so I know, the gut is closely connected to the brain, right? So we're kind of
Mhm.
talking about like nervous system issues influencing a lot of these things. Would you say that like helping the kids in regulating their nervous system and learning how to like regulate themselves is an important part in working through this?
Yeah, it's a huge part. I really do think so because when we're eating, we want to be in the parasympathetic, right? Because we want to be in the rest and digest state. And if we are in the fight or flight, we really cannot have enough resources or we cannot really properly really even digest food or focus on eating because we're overstimulated, because we cannot focus on that right now. We're focusing on survival, right? That's just like our biology. This is the way that we're wired. So if we're stressed, it's really hard to eat, even for adults, right? If we're sick, we don't have appetite. If we're stressed out, we go either way usually. We either like binge eat or we don't want to eat. So it's usually some kind of behavior around food that gets triggered because we are in this fight or flight. But when we are eating and when we're calm and we're able to really attend to the food and be in this rest and digest, that's truly the state we want to be in when we're eating. And that's again just simplifying it. But I do think that nervous system regulation as well as connection, especially for kids, because they're just so dependent on their caregivers and on their connection with their parents or whoever their caregiver is, with their mom. When they don't have that, that causes them stress. So I do think that for kids, that's really important as well as part of that nervous system regulation. But I think it's a huge part of it. That's a huge part of like this biological component for the child.
Yeah. What would you say makes, because you said that picky eating now is like one in every three kid? Is that
Yeah.
correct? What would you
Yeah.
say, if you know, and I know again, it's super complex, but I'm just curious what your answer is. What would make one kid more susceptible to another kid?
I think it's kind of goes back to not really the how do I say this? Not really the genes, right? Not really the genealogy. It's more so about the environment. Some kids, I love, I don't know if you know Documenting Hope, but the way that they talk about like the total load theory, right? All of us, we kind of have this like bucket of how much we can handle, right? And these buckets are, I feel like, getting smaller and smaller in our kids because, and when I mean like how much they can handle, how much they can handle of like the toxicity around them and like those things that are kind of unhealthy, right? So for kids, those buckets are getting smaller and smaller. So I feel like this is why we're getting more and more picky eating because it's a symptom of something else happening in the body. And because they can't really handle it. So that's why now, like 1 in 5 kids has eczema, 1 in like 10 kids has ADHD, and those numbers are growing, and autism numbers are growing because there are kids, they just cannot handle all that toxicity that we have around us. And I think it's the same with picky eating. Kids are just unfortunately unable to handle all that stress, and that can come from many different sources. It could come from like the EMFs, it can come from ultra processed foods, it can come from glyphosate, it can come from antibiotic use, so many different things that we have to deal with and take on. And our kids are unfortunately suffering from it because they're being born into a toxic world so they can handle less and less. And then when you look at their birth history, were they born through the vaginal canal, were they born through C-section, that will have an impact on how they can handle things.
Yeah, and the gut
Because we
microbiome
well,
too.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, right? Because if you're born without the birth microbes that you need to get through the vaginal canal, you already are unfortunately set up to have a harder fight. So all these
Hmm.
things I think play a role here.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super interesting.
Yeah.
So let's say if you're talking with a parent and their kid is struggling with picky eating and they maybe have tried like all of the like therapies for like trying to help their kid be able to eat more food.
Mhm.
What are some areas that you would say that parents tend to miss the most that are the most important?
Yeah. So when it comes to therapy, it depends on who you see. Uh, Typically, that is either a speech language pathologist, because we are trained. I'm an SLP, so we're trained in feeding therapy, and so are occupational therapists, just in different areas. Like SLPs were more focused on the swallowing aspect, the oral motor skills of chewing and learning how to eat. So kind of like focusing from that area. And occupational therapy is more so of like that sensory aspect of eating and kind of learning how to self-feed and eat in general. So those are all important areas. But if we look at feeding, we have to look at more things, right? Because it's just more and more complex. So we have to look at things like gut health and biology and setting appropriate boundaries around the table. And I think that's kind of what's missed sometimes when you only go to these types of therapies because they only focus on those two areas and they don't look at the whole child. So I think that's where the disconnect is. And I can say that for sure because I myself used to be doing this type of therapy because that's what I was trained to do. I was trained to look at it very behaviorally, right? Kind of focusing on the behaviors. And expanding the diet that way. So, for example, if a child ate 5 foods, my goal would be to get them to eat 10 foods or to take another bite. And it was very much kind of like rigid, not necessarily looking at the quality of life and their whole child picture. Um, and very much using behavioral therapy techniques because that's what we learned to do, kind of this ABA, applied behavioral analysis based techniques.
Mm.
And what I find, picky eating, oftentimes, that can work for some kids, but if they have root cause issues where they're really struggling because food makes them feel uncomfortable, or they have these crazy cravings because of gut imbalances and other things, these don't get addressed. So when we're only focusing on the behaviors, we're just missing so much. And we're not going to make any changes because those things are going to remain and kids are going to continue to struggle with these things with the gut health and biology, whatever the balanced health issues are. And if we only focus on these few areas, we're not going to make progress.
My internet cut out a little bit, so we're gonna have to like dive back into it. But yeah, moving on from what we were talking about before. So I wanted to dive a little bit more into like nervous system and sensory connection when it comes to picky eating. So kind of like transition a little bit here. So I would love if you could explain the connection between sensory processing and eating challenges, like picky eating and the motor issues.
Yeah, so sensory processing is often a component of picky eating. And typically what happens is the child's senses will get overwhelmed. So sometimes it's the look of foods, sometimes it's the smell of food, sometimes it's the feel of it, right? So the texture, it can just feel a little too much or too little. This is why kids might like have too big of bites, or they're really wary and they don't want to try something. Or when they do, they gag or have this big reaction. So it could be really any of the senses that just tend to overwhelm the child because they're struggling with their sensory processing around it, which things for us could feel neutral, right? It could be things like just a piece of chicken, and to a child could be this entire sensory experience, just like smelling it, touching it, putting it in their mouth and taking a bite, these bites might feel just so overwhelming. So oftentimes when kids struggle with that, they're going to start to become protective, or they might not want to try a certain food, or they might be just wary of trying new things that they're not familiar with because they don't want to overwhelm their senses.
Hmm. Yeah. So when they have some, sorry, you cut out a little bit, but when they have some like dysregulation, in their nervous system where they're highly sensitive, this leads to struggles with like textures and different like
Yeah.
trying new foods.
Yeah, and it's usually also gut related or nutritional deficiency related as well. A big nutritional deficiencies that is typically seen that's connected to sensory processing in picky eaters is zinc. Like if they're low in zinc, oftentimes you'll see these sensory processing issues. And it could be not
Interesting.
just food. Yeah, it could also be like things are too loud, right? Maybe they can struggle with loud noises or the hand dryer in the restroom. It could be little things like that. The vacuum can be a little bit too much, or it could be the feel of their clothes. It could be so many different things, like maybe tags bothering them, or, just different materials. So it could come up in many different areas.
Do they understand like I know you mentioned like zinc, so we can go into that a little bit because I'm kind of curious. Do they understand like the mechanism of how that works, like how a deficiency in zinc leads to a sensitivity or those type of sensitivities?
I'm not sure actually. I don't know where the connection is, but it comes up a lot. I also think
Hmm.
sometimes because zinc and calcium, like that balance is so important, right? Sometimes when we are like supplementing with zinc, we can throw off our calcium a little bit. So I wonder if there's a connection there. I feel like it could go many different ways. I'm not really sure if it was like extensively studied recently, but I know that, that's a big
Mm.
connection there. But that's a good question.
Yeah, they're like, there's a connection. We don't know how
Yeah.
yet, but
Yeah.
we're finding it. That tends to
Yeah.
be how it goes, at least nowadays, especially when it
Yeah.
comes to things like this. But that's super interesting. Are there
Yeah.
other like nutrient deficiencies that you see a lot with kids who have like sensory issues and picky eating?
Magnesium tends to be one. We're like just severely depleted of magnesium, and that can also cause things like constipation and other things as well, right? So that's a big
Yeah.
one. And iron is another one. So it's and omegas. So I feel like those are probably the biggest one, and vitamin D. I mean, that's just bad
Yeah.
overall. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're
And
severely
that's
depleted there.
interesting. Sounds
Yeah,
like mineral balance is really important.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Would you say for like parents who have kids that are struggling with it, would you say like those are really important things to get like tested from the doctor to see if they are deficient in it?
Yeah, I would say yes. My only drawback here is that some kids, they get so stressed out because of it. Like my son, it was like such a traumatic experience when we had to get his blood work done, for like a different reason. So I would say yes, but also we can assume like if their diet is so poor, where they're only eating like 5 foods or 10 foods and they're not really eating certain types of foods, then we probably can assume that they are. Although it's nice to get it checked. Like, I feel like there's pros and cons behind getting it checked.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I feel
but
like iron would be one of the more important ones to get checked, but like zinc, magnesium, and what was the other one you said? Oh,
omegas,
omega 3. Those are
omega 3.
typically really safe to get to
Yes,
supplement because you're typically supposed to supplement with those every single day anyway.
right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And there is ways of getting these in, like through foods. And I know it's hard because of picky eating, but a lot of picky eaters, they'll have smoothies. So even adding in some foods that are rich in these minerals, that's one way. So like what do you call this? Like pumpkin seed powder. So like pumpkin seeds in general, those are very rich in zinc and magnesium, and they have some iron in them. So like you can add in a little bit of that to the smoothie just to like, bring some of these minerals up and see if that helps. It's very minimal, but there's definitely ways of going around it as well, where you can kind of like supplement more naturally if you're nervous to do like supplementation.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea for sure.
Yeah.
I like using real foods. And I feel like also if they're having a hard time like swallowing and eating food supplement like a pill would
Yeah.
also cause an issue. So I think powder forms or like real food
Yeah.
forms may be a little bit easier sometimes, just
Oh, for
depending on what they're
sure.
able to do. But
Yeah. But
yeah,
but
interesting.
but for kids, you can usually find like a liquid form or
Mm,
powder as well. So that's another
yeah,
way of going about it. Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. I would love to dive into your Bloom framework a little
Mhm.
bit and how it helps parents decode picky eating at the root. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I imagine my bloom framework kind of like this large tree, and at the bottom of like the trunk, you have connection, right? Like we talked about the nervous system and connection in general, because when you connect with your child, you bring their stress level down. And they're just able to be so present and so willing to try different things. And also, you start to observe things. You start to notice signs and symptoms that maybe you would have missed if you're kind of rushing to make dinner and you kind of disconnect, because so many of us were just so disconnected nowadays that I think really focusing on connection first is really important here for many different reasons. But Bloom
Mm,
stands for B, balance health. So we talked a little bit about this, and that's things like sleep, blood sugar regulation, nutritional deficiencies, that's nervous system regulation, that's just looking at like the anxiety piece around the food. It's really their health in general as it pertains to eating. Then we have L, which is learned oral skills and swallowing. So those are things like chewing appropriately and not overreacting with food, kind of like gagging and coughing, and making sure that they're able to actually um, make the food that we have into a bolus, which is kind of like when we chew our food, we usually make it into this like mush, and we call that a bolus, and then we're able to swallow it. So making sure that we're able to make that bolus and we're able to transport it into our digestive system, right? So it goes through without any issues. Then we have the first O, which is optimal microbiome. So again, looking at that gut-brain connection, making sure there is not a leaky gut or many different overgrowths that could be causing issues around eating. The second O is open exploration. So setting up an environment where kids are willing to explore food, where they're excited to explore food, and it's really focusing on that environment around the table. And not only though, because sometimes before the child is even kind of ready to try food, maybe they first have to interact with it in a different way. So that could be through shopping for foods, maybe going to the garden and picking foods first, or helping to prep it, helping to wash it. So looking at that open exploration piece to make sure that they have enough opportunities to interact with the food before they're ready to eat it. And that's going to really depend on the child. And then the last one is the M, which is mealtime boundaries, because there are kids really thrive on boundaries around eating, around the table, having a clear direction, knowing what to do. Because when they don't, sometimes they don't have reaction direction, but they're also not. Um, they don't feel safe without that kind of directions and knowing what's expected of them. When it's kind of inconsistent direction, where sometimes you're bribing them, sometimes you're telling them, just take one more bite and this and that, and they don't have clear rules around the table and know what's expected of them, that can feel stressful. Right? So I think mealtime boundaries are really, really important depending on the child, depending on their age, depending on what they can do. When you set the right type of boundaries in place, that can really push them towards exploration and towards eating new things. So that's kind of my framework. I really like it because I feel like it looks at all
Awesome.
the different areas. And yeah,
Yeah.
and it's been kind of a good roadmap for parents, I find.
Yeah, I love that. I think that hits on like a lot of good important areas for even like holistic health, the holistic health side of things, not even talking about picky eating. I think all of those things are extremely helpful.
Yeah.
For the mealtime like boundaries side of things, could you give an example of a few mistakes that parents tend to make at mealtime that tends to maybe obviously they mean well, but it might make things a little bit worse?
Yeah. It really depends on a child. But for example, things like um, maybe you have a 3-year-old who can't really sit at the table without taking breaks because they want to get up, they want to run around, and then maybe they want to come back, and maybe just having them sit at the table for 30 minutes until they finish like part of their meal, their entire meal, where their body is literally, wiggling around and they're trying to go because they can't really sit for that long. That's hard for a 3-year-old. But you're kind of treating them as if they're much older and you're expecting them to sit at the table for that long. So I feel like that would be one way to set like an appropriate boundary. Um, what's another one? Kind of maybe not even having any boundaries. For example, a child is, I don't know, starting to explore food with you, but every single time they get to the table, they don't want to try something, they get up and they get something else, right?
Mm.
So that's a boundary I would set when they're able to sit at the table and they're not overwhelmed, where maybe if they're older, they're not allowed to get up. They can only have the foods that are available at the table. So whether it's like tapas style dinner or whatever it is, you know, maybe making sure that they have a safe food there so that they're gonna eat something there. But you have this boundary in place where they really cannot get up and go make something else because they need to sit at the table. There are just so many different boundaries we can set, and I think it has to be appropriate or based on the child's attention level. It has to be based on their skill level. If the child has a lot of sensory deficits or maybe their sensory processing is heightened, maybe, for example, they can't stand the smell of a food. Maybe you don't have that food at the table when you're expecting them to sit there. Or maybe they can stand a look of a certain food or a look of a certain texture, the same thing, right? We kind of need to set them in a way that is going to set them up for success, but still push them towards exploration. And that makes
Mm.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
Okay.
those are really good things to do. And
Okay.
then I had another question that I wanted to expand on a little bit. So
Hmm.
we've talked about like nervous system regulation quite a bit already, but I would love to give some examples for the parents who are listening to this episode on some things that they can do to help support in their kids regulating their nervous system.
Yeah. So my first one that I always talk about, and I think this is this is something that is going to make a difference and impact not only the nervous system, but also the gut and their health in general, is going outside, right? We need to be out in the sun. It's going to help with our circadian rhythm, with our mitochondrial health, is going to help with our gut health because the sun spectrum actually affects, and not only, also the noises outside. Like just being outside, it affects the microbiome just as much as food does, right? So that's like kind of like a low-hanging fruit for those picky eaters, where it's hard for you to introduce more gut-friendly foods into their diet. So going outside is going to really help with nervous system regulation. And that can look many different ways, right? Because I know families are busy, they're running around, there's school, there's after-school activities, everything. So just kind of carving out time where you're able to be outside even for like 10 minutes. And usually what's amazing is being outside within the first hour of waking because the sun then is like really rich in red and infrared light, which is so healing and it really sets our hormone production. It helps our blood sugar regulation. It just the circadian rhythm, it kind of everything gets started there. So being able to do that and around sunset as well. So that's when the sun spectrum is the richest in red and infrared light. You also, for vitamin D production, we talked about that. That's so important for health in general and also for picky eating. But that only gets produced in our skin or in our body when we're outside during UVB, right, when the UVB rays are present, right? And then there's also UVA rays. So there's different sun spectrums throughout the day. So as much as you can go outside, it's just going to help our bodies feel regulated and better. So that and
Yeah.
grounding, just getting your kids digging in the ground and in mud and water, just playing outside is going to be great. If you're able to, for example, maybe dinner is right after school, maybe push it back 15 minutes so you can go for a walk 15 minutes before you guys start dinner. And that's going to help everybody to regulate and then come to the table feeling much, much better. So I feel like those are definitely some ways to help with that nervous system regulation. There's so many different things like learning how to breathe and maybe modeling smelling the flowers and, blowing out the birthday candles, depending on your child's age, and just really helping them sit down and relax. And sometimes, every child might have different needs. Some kids love stimulation, so maybe they love hugs and just hugging with you. That's going to help them regulate the nervous system. We can always go back and think about connection. How do I connect with my child? What is their love language? And that's already going to help with that nervous system regulation.
That's awesome. I love that. Going
Yeah.
outside is definitely super important.
Yeah.
The best infrared light therapy is the sun.
Oh, for sure. You can't
Yeah.
make a machine as strong as the sun, no matter
Yep.
how much you try, or
Yep.
whatever they tell you. It's just never going to be as good.
Nope. Never.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I know vagal nerve stimulation is also really helpful in regulating the nervous system and also improving the gut-brain connection.
Oh,
What are some
yeah.
things that you have found to be really helpful that parents can implement with their kids for stimulating the vagus nerve?
Yeah, I like to think of the vagus nerve as like that superhighway and that connection, that like main connection between the brain and the gut. So it's really important to work on that. And I do find that breathing is amazing, right? Like we talked about that a little bit. So really focusing on correct type of breathings, focusing on your belly breathing, things like singing, things like dancing, things like laughing. All of that stimulates the vagus nerve. And it helps with the gut-brain communication. So, anything like that, it's already going to help bring down or calm our nervous system and just make us happier and more willing to explore.
Hmm, that's
Even
awesome. I
humming. I
love
heard humming
that.
is really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Humming because you're
Yeah.
hitting like this certain frequency that is just so so healing to us. So, just
It's
humming
like
around with
listening
your
to birds
kids.
helps calm your nervous system too.
Yes. Oh,
Hmm.
yes. Like all the nature sounds,
Hmm.
which is hard when you live in a city because all of a sudden you have like a plane over your head and then you have all these cars zooming by. But just
Yeah.
now, especially like in the Northern Hemisphere, we have spring coming in. So it's just such an amazing time to get to hear all the bird songs and the
Yeah.
insects buzzing. Like it's such a great
Yeah.
time.
I was on
Yeah.
a walk earlier and the birds were so loud and then like
Oh,
Magpie came like right next to me and started like kind of screaming at me, but it was funny.
that's so
I was like,
funny.
oh, this is
Oh,
nice. They're getting happy.
yeah. Yes, they are. And they're starting first thing in the
Awesome.
morning too. Like, doesn't matter if you're sleeping. They're out
Yep.
there.
Yep. They don't care.
Yeah.
Awesome. I wanted to ask another follow-up question for the gut microbiome, the gut health side of things, just to help parents out a little bit when they're trying to like figure out what's going on.
Hmm.
You mentioned a lot about like bacterial overgrowths. Are there any like specific bacterial overgrowths that you see most common for kids who are picky eaters, like Candida or SIBO or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, nothing specifically, because I'm definitely not an expert
Okay.
in this area. But those things for sure, because oftentimes then those are going to also manifest in different ways in different comorbidities. So it could be many different ones, right? Candida is definitely one.
Yeah.
Different viruses. You have so many different, like, I find it so fascinating studying the microbiome because there are just so many different ones, right? You can have like
Yeah.
E. coli, or you can have H. pylori, which is then if, which a little bit usually is okay, but like once you go into this like big overgrowth, then that can cause really hard things with digestion and then loose stools and things like that. So I feel like there's just so many, as long as like your stomach is affected in any way, oftentimes with kids who are just so much more sensitive, it's going to cause, picky eating and appetite differences and digestion differences. So it's going to affect how they eat.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely understand that it could be any of the above.
I
If your
know.
kid has had I was gonna say if your kid has had like food poisoning, I would definitely recommend looking into that too, because that can make them
Yes,
more susceptible to like E. coli or stuff like that,
that's a
which can
great
cause some
point.
issues down the road too. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like, if you're suspecting that this is not just a phase, that this is true picky eating, you can have that conversation with with your doctor and see what kind of testing can I get done. And if your provider doesn't really know, like you can always look for a different provider because I think having guidance here, it's important.
Yeah. Trying to
Yeah.
figure out all of this on your own is going to be really difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, for
So
sure.
find someone who knows what they're doing because it'll make
Yes.
your life way
Oh
easier.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I have one final question. What is one simple shift that parents can make today to help reduce mealtime stress for their kids?
Yeah. Honestly, what they can do is work on their own stress levels first. Because once you're able to de-stress and regulate yourself more, and that can look many
Mm.
different ways depending on the person. But if you can come into this with calm and you can come into this where you're available for your child and you can truly see what's going on and focus on them versus on your own stress, I think that's going to be very powerful in how you're going to react and how you're going to be able to connect with them, how you're going to be able to pay attention to what's really going on, and how you're going to be able to help them regulate. So I think
Yeah,
that's one of the best ways because some of us, I mean, we're just stressed because of the lifestyle we're living right now and because we're juggling so many different things. So I think that's definitely something that you can do. Just kind of like this analogy when you're on an airplane, right? When they do the safety demonstration, you got to put your oxygen mask on first before you can help somebody else or your child. And I think it applies here
yeah,
very much as well.
yeah. And they also like feed off of like your nervous system and your energy, I guess you could say, as well. So
Yeah.
as much as like you're trying to help them with stuff, if you still have a lot of like dysregulation going on, they can still feel that too. So I love that.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Me
Well, I think
too.
that's everything. I think we got through quite a few things. I think this will be a
Oh, for
really
sure.
helpful episode for parents with kids who are picky eaters. So thank you
I
so
hope
much
so.
for coming on my podcast today.
Oh, my
To the
pleasure. Thank you for having
listeners,
me.
Yes, absolutely. And then to the listeners, thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Experience Health podcast. If this was helpful to you guys, send it to someone who needs it, another mother who is working through these things. And if you want to connect with Lena, I'll have all of her links in the description below so you'll be able to connect with her. So without further
Awesome.
ado, see you in the next episode. Bye.